Picture this. You're a hunter-gatherer living 13,000 years ago. There are obviously no supermarkets, no refrigerators, and absolutely no food delivery apps. You live in a cave in what will one day become Israel. So, you've been walking all day, your feet are aching, and one afternoon, someone in your group stumbles upon some wild grain. It's just been sitting in a wet stone mortar for, well, a little too long. It smells weird, it looks incredibly bubbly. Something profoundly biological and mysterious has clearly happened to it. And for reasons that completely defy all logical survival instincts, someone decides to drink it anyway. Honestly, that person might just be the most important human being who ever lived, because that single act of magnificent, reckless curiosity fundamentally altered human civilization forever. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to trace our astonishing 10 million year evolution with alcohol and uncover exactly why this bubbling grain water changed absolutely everything about how we live. Okay, let's dive into this by shattering a pretty massive assumption. We almost always tend to view drinking as a modern habit, right? Like a cultural invention or maybe just a social crutch. But to truly understand our relationship with alcohol, we have to start by asking the ultimate biological question. Were humans actually biologically designed to drink in the first place? Because for most animals, consuming ethanol is a deeply unpleasant or even flat-out fatal experience. Their livers simply stage in immediate protest. But for us and our primate relatives, the story is entirely different.
And this number is exactly where that story begins. 10 million. What this staggering number represents is the moment in history when a specific enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4, appeared in our primate ancestors. This is the enzyme that allows our bodies to break down and process ethanol with incredible efficiency. And the part that should absolutely stop you in your tracks is that this adaptation happened 10 million years ago. That is so long before Homo sapiens existed. It's before anything we would even recognize as a human being was walking the earth. Long before we were consciously choosing to brew anything, our biology was already preparing for a very deep relationship with alcohol.
To explain why this happened, we have to look at a brilliant concept from UC Berkeley biologist Robert Dudley, and it has perhaps the greatest name in the history of science, the Drunken Monkey hypothesis. This is the theory that primates were naturally selected to prefer the smell of alcohol. Why? Well, because our ancient ancestors survived on enormous quantities of fruit. And when fruit gets perfectly ripe, yeasts in the environment consume its sugars and naturally produce ethanol. The fruit literally starts to smell like alcohol. So that scent wasn't a warning sign to them, it was an evolutionary beacon. It meant that this particular piece of fruit was at its maximum ripeness, maximum sweetness, and maximum caloric value. The ancestors who followed that smell got more food and survived. So having a biological pull toward the smell of booze isn't some character flaw, it's actually an ancient survival mechanism.
And we've got the modern biological proof to back this up. Researchers went out into the wild to test this hypothesis, and the results are just incredible. Wild black-handed spider monkeys in Panama actively choose to eat fruit that naturally contains between 1 and 2% alcohol by volume. And when scientists analyzed their urine, they found proof that these monkeys aren't just eating it, they're actively metabolizing the ethanol. Even more wild, studies on chimpanzees in the Ivory Coast show that their normal daily foraging exposes them to the equivalent of 1 to 2 full human drinks every single day. Our ancestors were getting a mild, completely unintentional buzz just by foraging for their everyday food.
Section 1. The beer before bread debate.
So, we know primates accidentally consumed fermented fruit for millions of years. But about 13,000 years ago, cognitively modern humans stopped just accidentally consuming alcohol and deliberately began brewing it. Using large, carved stone bowls found inside Rakefet Cave in Israel, a semi-nomadic people called the Natufians went through a really complex 3-stage brewing process. First, malting, which involves germinating wild wheat and barley in water. Second, mashing and heating it. And third, leaving it to ferment with wild airborne yeast. Think about that. This is an intentional, technically demanding, multi-step scientific process to make beer, happening 13,000 years ago, which, incredibly, is long before organized farming was even a thing.
So, the crucial point is how this discovery completely upends our understanding of human history. On one hand, we have the traditional bread and nutrition first hypothesis. That's the idea that humans settled down and invented agriculture because we needed a reliable food supply. Makes sense, right? But on the other hand, we have archaeologist Brian Hayden's highly controversial beer before bread hypothesis, and that Natufian discovery gives this massive weight.
Did nomadic hunter-gatherers trade their free-roaming lifestyle to break the ground and plant seeds just to ensure a guaranteed supply of beer? A beverage that was calorie-dense, safer to drink than the local water, and absolutely perfect for communal feasts? The evidence is strongly suggesting that the desire to make alcohol actually predates and possibly even caused the agricultural revolution.
Section 2. A global fermentation phenomenon.
Now, this wasn't just happening in one isolated cave in the Mediterranean. Across entirely different regions, humans were figuring this out completely independently. In Jiahu, China, 9,000 years ago, they were already brewing an ancient fermented cocktail of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. Over in Ora, Georgia, 8,000 years ago, we see the earliest confirmed wine fermented in massive clay vessels called kfavri. And back in China at Kaotou, also 9,000 years ago, they were already using highly advanced mold-based fermentation starters. Those are actually the direct ancestors to how sake is made today. Remember, these ancient cultures had absolutely no contact with each other, no text messages, no trade route sharing recipes. What this proves is that humanity is simply incurably fermentation curious. Give humans enough time and ingredients, and we will inevitably figure out how to brew.
Section 3. The business of booze.
Once we figured out how to make it reliably, alcohol evolved into a highly organized bureaucratic and economic institution. Look at Mesopotamia. Beer was fundamental to the literal functioning of their society. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer, it was their payroll system. Now, what's really interesting about this is how workers building temples and digging canals were systematically paid daily rations of about 2 liters of beer. It functioned as wages, as currency, as medicine, and as the glue of their social fabric. It was so deeply embedded in their economy that later on, the Babylonians meticulously documented over 70 distinct varieties of beer. Light, dark, spiced, honey-infused, all at a time when most of the world was still just trying to build basic farming villages.
The Sumerians loved beer so sincerely that they literally revered it through religion. They created an entire goddess dedicated to brewing named Ninkasi, which magnificently translates to the lady who fills the mouth. They even wrote a religious hymn to her around 1800 BCE. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just a hymn, it was essentially a step-by-step brewing recipe embedded in a poem. And here is a fantastic, surprising fact. That ancient recipe was so scientifically precise that in 1989, an American brewer named Fritz Maytag actually used it to successfully recreate Ninkasi's 3,800-year-old beer. It came out to about a 3.5% alcohol content and apparently tasted like champagne mixed with dates.
And because beer was the absolute lifeblood of the economy, it had to be protected. There's this incredible rule, paraphrased from the Code of Hammurabi, dating back to 1754 BCE. It literally states that if a tavern owner is caught watering down their beer, the punishment is being thrown into the river. You gotta love the historical quirk here. Humanity's very first great written legal code didn't just cover property and theft. It included hardcore life-or-death consumer protection laws for the quality of your beer. We have clearly always known what's important.
Moving over to Egypt, we see a fascinating dual culture emerge. On one hand, beer acted as genuine public health infrastructure. Because the Nile water could carry dangerous pathogens, the daily workers who built the pyramids were paid in a thick, nutritious, low-alcohol beer. Its natural antimicrobial properties made it so much safer to drink than water. But on the other hand, wine served an entirely different purpose. Wine was highly guarded prestige wealth. It was reserved for high ceremonies and elites. In fact, when excavating the tombs of pharaohs, archaeologists found sealed wine jars complete with the world's absolute oldest vintage labels, noting the year, the vineyard, and the vintner.
Section 4. A sacred human tradition.
As we begin to wrap up this explainer, we really need to recognize that alcohol in the ancient world was never simply about having a good time. Across every single continent where the earliest evidence of alcohol production has been studied, it is fundamentally tied to survival, community, death, and the spiritual realm. Those Natafueans we talked about, they didn't brew beer for a weekend barbecue. They brewed it in burial caves strictly to honor their dead. The Egyptians offered their precious prestige wine to Osiris, the god of the dead, at the border of the afterlife. In China, 9,000-year-old tombs contained painted pottery vessels holding beer specifically made for the deceased. These ancient humans deeply understood that the altered states provided by these fermented beverages were a meaningful doorway. It was a way to step outside the bounds of ordinary perception and connect with something profoundly larger than themselves.
Let's pull back and see how this builds into an absolutely epic timeline. It is breathtaking to look at this massive scale all in one sweep. 10 million years ago, a genetic mutation allows our primate ancestors to metabolize ethanol in ripe fruit. Fast forward to 13,000 years ago, and Natufian hunter-gatherers are intentionally brewing beer in stone bowls. By 9,000 years ago, independent cultures from China to Georgia are simultaneously discovering the magic of fermentation entirely on their own. And by 1754 BCE, civilizations have grown so incredibly complex that Hammurabi is laying down fierce legal codes to protect tavern beer in Babylon. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. What if humanity didn't just stumble into alcohol by accident? What if, driven by 10 million years of evolutionary biology and thousands of years of sacred ritual, we grew toward it, the way a plant naturally grows toward the light? The next time you hold a glass, take a moment to realize that your drink isn't just a beverage. It is tethered to millions of years of unbreakable biological and cultural momentum. It's an uninterrupted chain of human curiosity, community, and survival. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely reframe how you view humanity's two most common, everyday vices by looking at their deep, evolutionary origins. You know, if you look around today, drinking and smoking are literally everywhere, woven right into the very fabric of our modern lives. But to truly understand them, we got to stop looking at them as just casual modern habits and start viewing them through the lens of deep time.
So, I want you to picture your ancient ancestors. They're standing around a campfire maybe 50,000 years ago or foraging in a prehistoric forest. Ask yourself, when did they actually start doing this on purpose? Was it a conscious choice? A happy accident? We usually assume that the desire to grab a drink or smoke a pipe was something invented right alongside agriculture or human civilization. But the archaeological and biological records, they tell a completely different, frankly mind-blowing story.
And the part that should absolutely stop you in your tracks is this staggering number right here. 10 million years ago. That's right, the biological groundwork for these behaviors started millions of years before Homo sapiens even existed, before Homo erectus, before anything walking on two legs that we would even recognize as human. For 10 million years, long before we were consciously choosing to drink or smoke, our physical bodies were already actively preparing for this relationship. Absolutely wild.
All right, moving into our first section, a deep evolutionary pull. Let's look at the actual biological drives behind these vices.
To wrap our heads around alcohol, we've got to look at something called the Drunken Monkey hypothesis. It's a brilliant idea that shows how a 10-million-year-old enzyme mutation, specifically an enzyme called ADH4, meant our primate ancestors were getting a mild buzz just by eating the very best fruit in the jungle. See, when fruit gets perfectly ripe, environmental yeast turns its sugars into trace amounts of ethanol. And the smell of that ethanol, it wasn't a warning sign, it was actually a beacon signaling maximum calories. The primates who followed that scent survived longer and they had more offspring. So evolution literally selected us to seek out the smell of booze.
Now, for smoking, we look to what's known as the intoxication hypothesis. This reveals that the drive to alter our minds is actually a universal, biological urge. We share it with everything from early humans all the way to Siberian reindeer. This hypothesis suggests the pursuit of intoxication is an ancient biological drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and sex. Whether it's elephants seeking out fermented fruit or reindeer eating psychoactive mushrooms, the desire to step outside our ordinary perception, it isn't a human flaw. It's a deeply embedded behavioral drive across the entire animal kingdom.
Which brings us to our next section, the first accidental hits. We're talking prehistoric campfires and ripe jungle fruits.
The absolutely crucial point here is that before intention, there was an accident. Our ancestors definitely didn't invent these feelings in a lab. Encountering them was just a byproduct of everyday survival. Think about early fire, right? A million years ago, Homo erectus sat around contained fires, breathing in wood smoke every single day in places like Wonderwork Cave down in South Africa. When you burn certain plants, they release psychoactive chemicals, and because we already had this pre-existing endocannabinoid system regulating our mood and memory, our neural receptors eventually caught these accidental hits of burning plants. Our brains weren't confused by the smoke. Instead, they essentially said, "Oh, hello, I've been waiting for you." The whole modern history of smoking probably started with a tired hunter sitting downwind of the wrong bush and having an unexpectedly great evening.
When you lay it out like this, you can clearly see how perfectly our bodies were biologically preparing to process these specific substances thousands of millennia before we ever intentionally sought them out. On one hand, we evolved the ADH4 enzyme to digest fermenting jungle fruit. On the other, our endocannabinoid receptors naturally processed psychoactive campfire smoke. Basically, the biological hardware was fully installed and running long before the software of human intention ever booted up.
Let's move to our next section, sacred rituals and burials, where we see the transition from accident to pure intention.
So, this is the exact moment cognitively modern humans stopped stumbling into these feelings by accident and started orchestrating them deliberately. It took memory, observation, and honestly, something pretty close to early science. Just look at this shockingly sophisticated multi-step brewing process used 13,000 years ago by nomadic Natufians in an Israeli cave. They were brewing beer long before agriculture even existed. I mean, they weren't farmers. They gathered wild wheat and barley and put it through this exact three-step process specifically to brew beer ritually for their dead. It completely upends our timeline. It suggests the desire for reliable beer might have actually been the main reason humans settled down and invented farming in the first place. Crazy, right?
And we see something very similar with smoking. A 12,000-year-old hearth in Utah was found packed with highly concentrated wild tobacco seeds. This proves early humans were intentionally utilizing smoke way before pipes were ever a thing. These seeds didn't just casually blow into the fire. They were deliberately placed there. That means thousands of years before Columbus or any European contact, indigenous populations had already mastered the purposeful inhalation of smoke. They treated it as a sacred, living carrier of prayers and visions.
When we map it all out, this timeline beautifully shows how completely isolated cultures independently discovered fermentation and intentional smoking in roughly the exact same window of human prehistory. You've got a 9,000-year-old mixed cocktail of rice, honey, and fruit in China. Over in Georgia, 8,000-year-old wine. These societies were definitely not trading recipes with each other. They each figured it out entirely on their own, and they treated these substances not as casual party favors, but as sacred bridges to the divine, using them to mark births, deaths, and the turning of the seasons.
We even have historical witnesses corroborating this deep history. Take the famous Greek historian Herodotus. In the 5th century BC, he describes Scythian nomads using enclosed tents and heated stones to inhale hemp smoke, literally writing that they were howling with pleasure. Now, for centuries, historians thought the guy was just exaggerating. But when archaeologists recently excavated 500 BC burial mounds, guess what? They found the exact bronze braziers, the heated stones, and the high THC hemp residue that Herodotus described. The ritual was entirely 100% real.
All right, next section, medicine and early civilization. Let's look at how this built our early social fabric. From sacred burial rites and nomadic tents, these exact same substances evolved to become the social and medical infrastructure of the very first massive human civilizations. In places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, alcohol wasn't just a fun, recreational drink. It was safe public health infrastructure. Since local water could carry dangerous pathogens, low-alcohol fermented beer was genuinely safer to drink. It was literal currency used to pay the builders of the pyramids, and it was fiercely protected by early written laws. Get this, the Code of Hammurabi, literally one of humanity's first legal codes, included strict consumer protection laws that penalized tavern owners who watered down their beer. They took it very seriously.
They revered this civilizing power so much that they dedicated an entire goddess to it, Ninkasi. The Sumerians wrote a hymn to her around 1800 BCE. But here's the coolest part. This wasn't just a poem. The hymn actually functions as a perfectly accurate, reproducible brewing recipe. Back in 1989, a modern brewer actually used the hymn to recreate the ancient beer, and 3,800 years later, the recipe still worked perfectly. How amazing is that?
At the exact same time, smoking was undergoing its own organized evolution. And again, it wasn't recreational. It was a sophisticated, logical delivery mechanism used by early doctors. From the ancient Egyptians using inhaled herbal smoke for throat issues, to Hippocrates in Greece, to a 3,000-year-old Ayurvedic practice in India called Dhumapana, smoke was medicine. Because the smoke reaches the lungs directly, delivering pharmacological properties via inhalation made complete logical sense to ancient physicians. And beyond the medicine, sharing these altered states was a crucial social technology that built trust and deep group cohesion for early human survival.
Which brings us to our final section, the shift to modernity, going from sacred rites to casual habits.
This is where we hit a massive, kind of uncomfortable historical shift.
This is when these deeply rooted biological practices were stripped of their ancient reverence and just rapidly commercialized. Consider the stark contrast we're looking at here. You have the disciplined practices of an ancient shaman connecting to the spirit world, acting with deep reverence. Compare that against the mass-market mechanics of modern industrialization. Over just a few centuries, global industries took these ancient plants and completely transformed them. They engineered them, adding chemical compounds to maximize addiction and mass-produce physical dependence for profit. Both involve smoke, sure, but practically nothing else about the modern version resembles its ancient origins.
Yet despite all that modern commercialization and the loss of that ancient reverence, the biological and historical through line remains totally unbroken. When you hold a drink today, you are participating in a literal 9,000-year unbroken chain of human curiosity, survival, and fermentation knowledge. That glass on the table tonight connects you directly to a hunter-gatherer 13,000 years ago who tasted something strange in a stone bowl and thought, hey, this is remarkably good.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. The next time you smell wood smoke on a cold night or hold a glass of wine, take a second to consider where that desire actually comes from. How much of your modern, everyday habits are truly your own conscious choice? And how much is just the ancient, deeply ingrained intelligence of our species, shaped over 10 million years, silently breathing through you?